When Canadian forces finally secured the Scheldt Estuary in late 1944, the military consequences were immediate. But inside Hitler's headquarters, the psychological impact may have been just as severe. By this stage of the war, Germany was already fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. The Red Army was pushing relentlessly from the east. Allied bombers were devastating German cities. And in the west, the Allies had broken out from Normandy and were racing across France and Belgium. Yet Hitler continued to cling to the belief that a decisive reversal was still possible. The loss of the Scheldt struck directly at that illusion. To understand why, you have to look at what the Scheldt actually meant. The estuary controlled access to the port of Antwerp, one of the largest and most strategically valuable ports in Western Europe. The Allies had captured Antwerp intact in early September 1944. But as long as German forces held the Scheldt's approaches, the port was useless. Supplies couldn't safely reach it. Allied armies advancing into Belgium and the Netherlands were stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. For Germany, holding the Scheldt was one of the last practical ways to slow the Allied momentum. Hitler knew this. He understood that if Antwerp became operational, it would transform the logistical balance in the West. The Allies would no longer be dependent on long supply routes from Normandy. They would have a deep water port close to the front lines, capable of sustaining large-scale offensives into Germany itself. So when Canadian troops, after brutal fighting in flooded terrain and fortified positions, forced the German 15th Army to retreat and cleared the estuary, it wasn't just another territorial loss. It was a strategic door swinging wide open for the Allies. Reports from the period show that Hitler reacted with fury to setbacks on the Western Front, and the Scheldt was no exception. By late 1944, his leadership style had become increasingly rigid and emotional. He distrusted his generals, blamed them for failures, and refused to acknowledge the deteriorating military reality. When informed that German forces were being pushed back in the Scheldt region, his instinct wasn't to authorize flexible withdrawals or reorganize defenses efficiently. Instead, he doubled down on his familiar command: hold fast. No retreat. No surrender. This kind of reaction had become characteristic of Hitler in the final year of the war. Earlier in the conflict, German commanders had often been allowed to maneuver, to withdraw strategically, to trade space for time. But by 1944, Hitler saw every retreat as weakness and every defensive fallback as betrayal. The result was a series of stand fast orders that trapped German units in untenable positions. In the Scheldt region, that meant troops were ordered to defend flooded islands, exposed causeways, and crumbling defensive lines against a determined and well-supplied Canadian assault. The emotional dimension of Hitler's response is important here. He had built his authority on the image of infallibility, the leader who defied generals and proved them wrong with bold decisions. But by late 1944, the pattern had reversed. The strategic situation was collapsing, and each loss chipped away at the narrative of control. The capture of the Scheldt symbolized something larger than a battlefield defeat. It represented the Allies solving their supply crisis and preparing for the final push into the heart of the Reich. That reality clashed violently with Hitler's insistence that Germany could still turn the tide. There's also the element of denial. Even as evidence mounted that the Western Front was weakening rapidly, Hitler focused his energy on planning counterblows rather than stabilizing defenses. Instead of treating the loss of the Scheldt as a signal to consolidate and conserve strength, he viewed it as justification for launching a dramatic offensive that would shock the Allies and restore German initiative. This mindset would soon manifest in plans for the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a gamble that aimed to split Allied forces and recapture Antwerp itself. In that sense, the Canadian victory at the Scheldt didn't just provoke anger. It intensified Hitler's desperation. The more ground Germany lost, the more he gravitated toward bold, high-risk operations to reverse the trend. The logic was increasingly detached from logistical reality. German fuel supplies were critically low. Reinforcements were scarce. Air superiority had shifted decisively to the Allies. Yet Hitler continued to issue orders as if sheer willpower could compensate for material weakness. What makes this moment especially revealing is how it highlights the widening gap between Hitler's perception and the situation on the ground. Commanders in the West understood how serious the loss of the Scheldt was. They recognized that once Antwerp was fully operational, the Allies would gain a sustainable supply base that Germany simply could not match. But rather than recalibrate strategy around this new reality, Hitler responded with blame, anger, and renewed insistence on absolute resistance. The capture of the Scheldt Estuary, therefore, wasn't just a tactical victory for Canada or a logistical triumph for the Allies. It was a psychological blow inside the German high command. It exposed how fragile Germany's position had become and how increasingly inflexible its leadership was. In many ways, it marked a point where the war in the West shifted from a struggle over momentum to a countdown toward inevitability, even if Hitler himself refused to see it that way. As the Scheldt Estuary fell under Canadian control, the consequences for the German 15th Army were immediate and devastating. This wasn't just a matter of losing ground on a map. It was the unraveling of an entire defensive structure that Germany had relied on to hold the Western Netherlands and protect one of the last viable approaches into the Reich. The 15th Army had already endured a chaotic retreat after the Allied breakout from Normandy, barely escaping destruction as it withdrew across France and Belgium. By the time it regrouped along the Scheldt, it was battered, overstretched, and tasked with defending terrain that was as unforgiving as the enemy advancing against it. The geography of the Scheldt region made everything more intense. Flooded polders, narrow dikes, exposed causeways, and fortified coastal positions turned the fighting into a brutal, close-quarters struggle. For the Germans, it was both a defensive advantage and a trap. They could slow the Allied advance, force costly assaults, and use the waterlogged terrain to their benefit. But once Canadian forces began systematically clearing strong points and isolating positions, German units found themselves cut off with limited options. Retreat routes were narrow and vulnerable. Supplies were inconsistent. Communication was strained. When Canadian troops secured key positions like South Beveland and Walcheren Island, the German 15th Army's cohesion began to fracture. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire formations were forced to abandon heavy equipment. Artillery pieces were left behind. Defensive lines that had taken weeks to construct collapsed in days. For an army that was already operating on reduced strength, these losses were crippling. The psychological impact on German troops shouldn't be underestimated either. By late 1944, morale across the Wehrmacht was uneven. Some units still fought with determination, particularly in defensive operations. But many soldiers were exhausted, aware that Germany was losing on multiple fronts. The loss of the Scheldt confirmed what many already feared. The Western Allies were not just advancing. They were solving their logistical problems and preparing for something bigger. That, something bigger, was the full operational use of the port of Antwerp. Once the Scheldt was cleared of German control, Allied minesweepers could open the waterway, and supply ships could begin unloading massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements. For the German 15th Army, this meant that any hope of starving the Allied advance into stagnation had vanished. The Allies were no longer limited by stretched supply lines from Normandy. They now had a logistical engine much closer to the front. From a strategic perspective, the collapse along the Scheldt exposed the broader weakness of Germany's western defenses. The 15th Army had been one of the primary forces guarding the approaches through the Low Countries. With its defensive network shattered and manpower depleted, Germany's ability to maintain a stable line in the Netherlands diminished significantly. This would have long-term consequences, not only for the immediate front but also for civilian populations in occupied Dutch territories, who remained under German control during the harsh winter that followed. Inside Hitler's command structure, however, the reaction did not center on consolidation or measured withdrawal. Instead, consistent with the pattern we saw earlier, there was an insistence on counterattack and retaliation. Hitler viewed the loss not as a signal to preserve remaining strength but as further justification for a dramatic offensive that would reverse the momentum in one bold stroke. In his mind, the solution to a collapsing front was not defensive realism. It was shock and surprise. This thinking directly fed into preparations for the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. The plan aimed to drive through the Allied lines in Belgium, split British and American forces, and ultimately recapture Antwerp. The logic was clear. If Antwerp could be seized or rendered unusable, the Allied supply advantage gained through the Scheldt would be undone. But the gamble required resources Germany could barely afford. Fuel reserves were critically low. Replacement troops were undertrained. Air support was limited. The irony is that the very collapse of the 15th Army in the Scheldt region contributed to the desperation behind the Ardennes plan. Instead of stabilizing weakened sectors, forces were scraped together for one last major offensive. Units that might have reinforced defensive positions in the Netherlands were redirected. The result was a high-risk operation that achieved temporary surprise but ultimately failed to alter the war's trajectory. For the soldiers of the 15th Army, the aftermath of the Scheldt meant continued retreat and constant pressure. Those who escaped capture regrouped further east, tasked with delaying the Allied advance wherever possible. But the strategic initiative was gone. The Allies dictated the tempo. German forces reacted. Every defensive stand became a temporary measure rather than part of a sustainable plan. The broader significance of this collapse ties directly back to the theme running through this entire moment in the war. The Scheldt campaign didn't just represent a Canadian battlefield victory. It exposed the structural weakness of Germany's Western defense and the increasingly rigid decision-making at the top. The 15th Army's defeat was not an isolated incident. It was part of a chain reaction. Once the Allies unlocked Antwerp, they unlocked momentum. Once momentum shifted decisively, Germany was forced into riskier and more desperate strategies. And that's what makes this chapter so telling. The fall of the Scheldt showed how battlefield losses, logistical realities, and leadership psychology were all converging at once. The German 15th Army's collapse was both a military event and a symbol. A sign that Germany's capacity to hold the West was eroding faster than its leadership was willing to admit. From that point forward, every German operation in the region carried the weight of inevitability. The front could bend. It could temporarily flare with resistance. But the underlying balance had changed, and there was no easy way back.